Welcome to this panel discussion entitled Refugees, Past Crises and Future Challenges. Thank you all indeed for coming. Although the concept of the refugee can be traced back to ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, the first modern definition of refugee status comes from the League of Nations in 1921, responding to the fallout from the Russian Revolution. Since then, the United Nations has adapted and modernized the definition to reflect the plight of the persecuted and the fearful across decades. In early September 2015, a photograph appeared in newspapers in this country and around the world that brought the ongoing refugee crisis to the forefront of people's consciousness. I'm sure you will remember. It pictured the body of a 3-year-old Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, on a tourist beach near Bodrum in Turkey. And I think that that one photograph in one day changed people's mental perception of what a refugee was. The concept of the refugee was changed. And of course there was, as I remember well, an immediate outcry. I was sent to Bristol to report for the BBC on the efforts of a charity that had suddenly popped up and was packaging up all kinds of supplies and collecting things to send out to the Mediterranean, doing their bit to deal with the suffering. But what the image had also done was to alert this country and others in the public conversation to the failures of the international system to deal with refugees, to deal with large movements of people. The European Union seemed incapable of fulfilling its responsibilities and commitments under the Geneva Convention. War, drought, disease, poverty, all of these had combined to trigger a wave of human misery and desperation that swept north and west to the edges of Europe, people clamoring to find safety and sanctuary. 1 million Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, and others arrived on the beaches of Europe in a little over a year. And of course, too many didn't actually make it. On the 13th of April 2015, more than 400 people drowned when a packed boat full of migrants sank off the coast of Libya. That year, close to 4,000 refugees and migrants died trying to cross into Europe. The following year, it was over 5,000, and many of them, of course, were children. In the face of this carnage, this vast tragedy, there was buck-passing and there was squabbling among the EU nations. In some parts of Europe, the crisis was exploited by populist politicians, particularly on the far right. In others, unfolding horrors saw a demand for humanitarian action among governments, among agencies, and also among ordinary people. So what happened? What went wrong? What should have been done differently? And what are the lessons for the future? We have a hugely knowledgeable panel to unpick some of these vital issues. To my immediate left, we have Rossella Pagliuchi, who is the UNHCR representative to the UK with over 30 years of experience in refugee and humanitarian work. To my far left, Gerald Knaus is founder and chairman of the European Stability Initiative, a think tank focusing on Southeast Europe and enlargement, but has much to say on the topic of refugees. And to my right, Christian Dustmann is professor of economics at UCL and a director of CREAM, not the 60s supergroup, I hasten to add, but the Center of Research and Analysis on Migration. So welcome one and all. I'm going to divide our conversation into two as best I can. Like our title, I want to do looking back to past crises, and then we'll have a sort of second round when we'll start thinking about the future challenges. And there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. We'll have roving microphones, so if something pops up and you think, well, that's just wrong, write it down, and then we'll come to you, hopefully before the end of the session. So, round one then. I think we should reflect on that grim period on the Mediterranean. Christian refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants have been traveling to Europe for centuries, but that period starting in 2015 was something exceptional. Could you just to start us off, put some kind of context on what actually happened.
Yes, sure. So I will kind of try to set the stage a little bit by providing some information about what happened over the last years, what actually do we mean when we talk about refugees, etc. So what is actually a refugee? Well, a refugee is defined according to the 1951 Geneva Convention for Refugees as an individual who, owning to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, etc. So clearly an individual which is personally persecuted for various reasons. The Geneva Convention of 1951, the GCR, as of April 2015, has been signed by 145 states, and the 1951 Convention, and the 1967 Protocol, which generalizes the 1951 Convention to individuals who are falling under such definition from around the world, has been signed by 142 states. Basically, all Western countries are signatories to the Geneva Convention and therefore are required to provide refuge to individuals who fall under that definition. You will have seen immediately that war is not part of the original 1951 definition. It does not address civilians fleeing wars and conflicts, individuals we are seeing today in large numbers, and Mark used for his introduction. However, they are now covered by different forms of temporary, subsidiary humanitarian protection, which, however, is differently interpreted in different countries and also in different member states across the EU. Now, how many refugees are there? The UNHCR is distinguishing between two populations. Population of concern, which are individuals who are moving to a Geneva Convention signatory country, individuals who are moving to a neighboring country, and individuals who are internally displaced. So the number, the latest numbers we could find means that population is about 68.5 million currently. Individuals who are defined usually as refugees are individuals who move to neighboring countries or who move to a GCR country, so excluding individuals who are internally displaced. Well, what about the worldwide refugee stock? In this graph, we have in blue refugee stocks for different years, and in what color is that actually? Orange. Individuals who are in the process of applying for asylum. So we distinguish between individuals who are in the process of applying for asylum and individuals whose asylum status has been granted. The blue ones are basically stocks of individuals whose asylum has been granted. You see that numbers have vastly increased. So since 2012, the total number of refugees has doubled. The number of asylum seekers at the moment in time in 2007 has basically tripled. So a large change just when we are looking at the numbers. Where do they actually come from? Well, refugee sources and destinations, Western and Southern Asia and Africa are the two continents where most refugees are originating from. At the same time, they are also the two continents where most refugees are actually getting some kind of refuge status. So if we kind of focus on Northern America and Europe, where we have these intensive discussions over the past years, the numbers are actually relatively modest compared to what we are seeing going on in Western Southern Asia and Africa alone. What is the composition of immigrant populations? Well, at present, in 2017, largest part from Syria, not surprisingly, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia, Congo, Sudan, Iraq, etc., etc. You can see the origin countries are mainly countries which are the direct neighbors of the European Union. I come back to that in a minute. Host countries, well, Turkey, Germany, Pakistan, Uganda, Lebanon, at etc., etc. Germany, the only country which really stands out among Western countries, very much due to the 2015 inflow which we have all witnessed. Now, how does the demography looks like? Well, pretty equal gender divide. When we look at the age distribution, what is quite remarkable is that actually 53% of refugees today are below the age of 18. So very young, and in that way also very shapeable in positive directions. Well, what is the difference between refugees and economic migrants? The BBC calls everybody a migrant, but I think that kind of misses the point a little bit. Well, first of all, as I pointed out earlier, refugees are individuals who are coming to us because they are protected under the 1951 Geneva Convention or subsidiary agreements. They typically do not choose their migration. They are also typically not prepared for their migration. That's very different from economic migrants who choose to migrate and who are often carefully prepared for their migration. Of course, that has important implications as to how they are able to integrate into receiving countries. There is limited or no preparation or selection for the economic or social circumstances of the destination country. Very often refugees don't really know where they are ending up, when that also leads to limited adaptability. Economic migrants, on the other hand, are often very carefully prepared and also selected according to the circumstances they find in the destination. So that is, of course, important for good adaptability. On the side of the host country, there is limited preparation or economic need for refugees. Well, we have seen that in the recent European experience, while host countries, when it comes to economic migrants, are very often economically driven. Those migrations are very often economically driven, and there is a demand for migrants because of scarcity of labor in particular occupations. Well, let me give you some consequence of that. If we look at the economic integration just in terms of employment and compare refugees and other immigrants for the US and many other European countries, so we have painstakingly put together those microdata here, what you can see is that in particular in the first years, there is a dramatic difference between those two groups in terms of their labor force participation. And I could continue with respect to other forms of human capital or engagement in labor markets. Now, what are the future challenges? Something Mark will, have us talk about in the second part of this panel. 60% of the population in Africa is currently below the age of 25, compared to 27% in Europe. Africa is the southern border of Europe. The population in Africa will increase from currently 1.3 billion to 2.5 billion in the next 31 years. Africa will account for more than half of the global population growth between 2017 and 2050, and until 2050, 26 African countries are projected to double their current size. And more importantly, among the 20 countries that are highest ranked according to the 2019 Fragile State Index, 19 are located in Africa and 3 in the Middle East. So what that means is that the challenges for Europe in terms of migration pressure on its southern and eastern borders will certainly not abate. If we just correlate population growth and fragility of state systems, we see that in the very upper group, we have only countries, both very unstable and both experiencing high predicted population growth. All these countries are in Africa and the Middle East. Compare that to the US, where we look at Southern American countries, they are far more to the left of that group of countries. So Europe will have to deal with that also in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come on to the other panelists in a moment, but I want to just, because you mentioned the BBC, and I'm always quick to jump in. So this business of defining who we're talking about here, I mean, the reason that the BBC is reluctant to call someone a refugee or an asylum seeker or an economic migrant in a specific is because we just don't know, and it's it can be disputed. The actual sort of justification for someone coming on a boat across the Mediterranean, it's not always clear what the motivation was. It might have been an economic motivation, it might be poverty, it might be disease, it might be war, it might be persecution, and we find it difficult to make that judgment. But it's also important, is it not, Christian, because actually this is where a lot of the politics comes into play. That countries say, oh yeah, we'll want to support refugees, and we've signed the convention, but we don't feel that we're in a position to take large numbers of economic migrants.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's a very difficult call to distinguish between those two groups of individuals. So technically, they clearly are migrants. Refugees are migrants. Economically motivated migrations are clearly migrations which are, moving individuals from one place to another. The point is that I think there is very little awareness of the humanitarian commitment we have made as signatories of the Geneva Convention.
To refugees.
To refugees. And
but not to economic migrants.
And of course, not to economic migrants. So
all people who are just fearful.
Absolutely. So much of what we are seeing at the moment is the attempt of Europe to actually fill in that particular commitment. So I think that is important to actually signal. On the other hand, there is a need for economic migrants because we have scarcity in many occupations, many professions which cannot be covered by our own labor force. And there, a well-managed migration policy is needed, which is, of course, not an obligation according to some signature under some international agreement. And I think that is important to really transport to the public.
Okay, we'll probably come back to this important point a little bit later, but Rossella, I'd like to bring you in now and your reflections on what was 2015 and the sort of popular awareness and anxiety about the refugee crisis as it was described. What do you think it was all about?
Thank you. Well, I think we've seen, I think, repeated many times that 2015 was this major refugee crisis in Europe. And I would like to start by disputing that. There was a crisis, but it wasn't in Europe. There's never been really a refugee crisis in Europe if you look at things in a certain perspective. In 2015, Europe received, let's say, taken leave about 1 million people. The European Union has a population of over 500 million people. About 1 million people is taken leave the number of Syrian refugees taken in by Lebanon, that has a total population of 5 million people. About 1 million refugees are in Uganda, about 1 million refugees in Bangladesh, about 3.6 million refugees in Turkey. So if you look at things in perspective, this very rich and very populous continent got about the same number of refugees as Lebanon, that is a very small country. Well, what happened there was that a number of factors came together. 2015 was the 4th year of the Syrian war, and already there were millions of Syrians essentially concentrated in the neighboring countries. What happened in 2015 that triggered that movement was that humanitarian budgets were cut. And the UN, and specifically the World Food Programme, found itself in the position of having to cut down on the assistance that was being provided to refugees in neighboring countries. At the same time, some of the countries in the region were starting to implement restrictive policies at the border. So many Syrians who found themselves in the situation of being there for 4 years, in many cases, having at that point exhausted whatever resources, savings they might have had. Many children were still not going to school, and that for Syrians was extremely important. You're talking about a largely urban population with many professionals that really highly value education. The kids were out of school. They had no resources. And at that point, many felt that they had no choice When they started moving, others joined in. But this is really what really triggered that particular movement at that particular time. Now, what happened at the other end, of course, was that Europe found itself very soon deeply fractured. And that's a fracture that hasn't yet healed, and I think we will discuss later, when we talk about what happens next. But we had both offers of very generous welcome and really a groundswell of popular support. You may remember the posters, people in the streets with the refugees welcome here. People opened their own houses to refugees. There was a huge support for that. However, there were also countries that almost immediately started building fences. And there was a way in which this could have been dealt, and there was an attempt at dealing with that by deciding on allocations. As I said, it's about 1 million people against a 500 million people population, 28 states. So really could have been managed fairly easily, but it wasn't. There was an attempt at establishing reallocations between the different countries. The council proposed 160,000 places allocated around. I think in the end, there were something like, it went down to about 90,000 and then less, and in the end, about 30,000 people were reallocated altogether. So clearly there was a crisis. It wasn't a refugee crisis. I think it was a crisis of identity for the European Union and determining what kind of union are we. The Europeans have always been very proud to define their union in values, in terms of values, but here they found themselves a bit challenged by what was happening. There was also a crisis of management. It was a management crisis, something that could have been dealt with in a fairly complexity, but it was manageable, and it wasn't. So that is, I think, where the crisis came up. But there were a number of results out of this, and I don't know whether we want to keep it for the second part of our conversation.
Certainly save something, Rossella.
But let me say something. Out of that, we had, on the one hand, the New York Declaration of 2016 that eventually led to the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018, and of a sort of twin, even though different in the way it is phrased and all the rest, but anyway, a compact on migration. Now, let me talk for the Global Compact on Refugees, since I'm talking about the refugee movement. It's about looking at refugee issues on a more holistic fashion. So on a whole of root approach, looking at how refugees, who, please remember, 85% of refugees, and I hook on what Christian said, 85% of refugees are not here, are in developing countries. So finding ways to help these countries provide better opportunities for refugees there in terms of allowing at least some resilience and education, etc., helping the host communities in those countries, because you're talking about very often fragile countries with in very difficult circumstances also for their own people, and then at the same time offering resettlement that is a regulated relocation of refugees to other countries as a manner of both expressing solidarity in a concrete manner, but also, because not everybody can stay there for a number of reasons. And ideally, trying to look also at ways in which eventually conditions can be made for people to go back. So it's a much more comprehensive and a much more, if you wish, strategic way of looking at refugees that go beyond just Russians until the money finishes, the funds are gone in countries of asylum, and then at the other end dealing with large numbers on the other side. So this is one of the positives that came out of that. There are some negatives too, and I think we have seen it because, of course, the large number of people coming was very visual. Europe hadn't seen that sort of thing for many, many years. Of course, there was a lot of welcome, but there was also some people feeling quite nervous about it. And one has to recognize that. And that, of course, provided ample fodder for the development of a different kind of discourse that sort of painted the refugees and immigrants as an existential threat to Europe, and a narrative that has had a number of impact and a certain success at the ballot vote.
Yes, and and that, I mean, I can take your point that, the refugee impact is far greater in other parts of the world. But what you had in Europe was, developed Western countries suddenly, as you say, being presented in the newspapers, on the television news, with the sight of people literally hammering on the door of the continent to come in a desperate way, and it did change the politics of Europe, didn't it? I mean, there were, quite difficult political situations developed, and I wonder what were the, at that time, where were the mistakes being made? Where were the errors at that point by the political leaders that as you say, could have made this more manageable?
Well, I think it's the real problem, Mark, was that the European Union failed to come together. They did not act as a union. And
but
isn't
that
where
the
the
reality,
problem
though?
comes.
You're going to have, the Hungarians are going to react differently to the Norwegians.
It may be the reality.
Not Norwegians, the
Swedes. Norwegians, yes. Well, they may indeed. There are reasons why this happens, but you asked me what is the problem? What's the mistake?
Right.
Well, that remains a problem and a mistake. In other words, we know why it is happening, but frankly, it shouldn't. I think this is a bloc of countries that has made a certain kind of statement and commitment, and I think it has failed to show both, in some cases, solidarity towards people who were fleeing persecution and war, and at an internal level, they failed to show inter-European solidarity. So obviously there have been very different approaches. Some governments, some countries have shown far greater leadership than others. But I think it's, yes, we know why it happened, but it was nonetheless, it shouldn't have. Let me put it this way.
Gerald, I want to bring you in here now because it does appear from what Rossella was saying as though this was something of an avoidable tragedy. Do you think that Europe, the European Union, the states of Europe, just took their collective eye off the ball? Was there a route through? Give us your thoughts.
Yes, well, thanks a lot. Well, let me put it like this. I would like to start with, or I phrase it in terms of 5 popular errors, which were very visible in that crisis, some of which were alluded to, and which persist. And they bedevil our thinking about borders and migration. But then perhaps also say something about the politics of it all. Now, the first error, and it's a very popular one, and you find it in a lot of books, including this one, which is written by an economist, Paul Collier, Refugee, is to use the term migration pressure. I would challenge you, and I want to be provocative for the debate, that this term makes no sense. There is no such thing that you can measure, and it shows us the dangers of metaphors. If we look at Africa, we did have a doubling of the population of the continent already in the last 30 years. But what did that mean? The idea of metaphors with water is that there are these connecting vessels, that if you stop migrants somewhere, they'll arrive somewhere else, that it almost is a futile thing unless you build huge dams, which is, of course, one of the favorite metaphors of the far right. And this is how politics has changed. I mean, some people did not commit errors. They used the crisis to come to power. Italy, the primary example, with Matteo Salvini building his whole career on rejecting the idea of a humane refugee policy. But also this man, Viktor Orban, who says that if things continue like this, with African population growing and this flood coming and no dams being built, Europe will change beyond recognition and the nations that we know will cease to exist. But how many people did actually come after 30 years of doubling the population of Africa, the continent next to Europe, in, let's say, 2010 or 2012 or last year? Well, here's the answer, and it may surprise you. In 2010, the total number of people who crossed the Mediterranean to Spain and Italy was 8,000 all year. And in 2012, it was 17,000. Now, these are numbers that show you that, in fact, with very few exceptions, there's been almost no migration between the continents And I'm not talking about a few years. I'm talking about decades. Here is last year. Last year, the total number of people who crossed the whole Mediterranean to Greece, Italy, and Spain was 114,437. Now, these are the IOM and UNHCR numbers, and what this tells you is that all year, to all of Europe, from the Middle East and Africa, the number was equivalent to the arrival of tourists in Greece in one day last August. Now, 115,000 all year from the whole continent to Europe is not an invasion. What actually happened, you see here. I mean, some of you will be economists, so you like to look at numbers. Well, look at Italy. Most years, the numbers of arrivals were very low. And then there were 4 exceptional years from 2014 to 17 when 650,000 people arrived. And the question, obviously, as a social scientist is, what happened then? The same is true for Spain. Just for your interest, Spain had a record year of arrivals last year, but it was only 60,000, which was less than arrived in a month in Greece in early 2016. Otherwise, Spain, so close to Africa, has almost no irregular migration across the sea. Second error, and again, I quote from this book by Paul Collier, 2015 revealed a broken refugee system, that there was something fundamentally broken in the way we thought about refugees. Like the Refugee Convention itself, he says, is outdated. Well, look at the Aegean, which we all remember. The arrivals, the deaths, the little boy Aylan Kurdi on the shore of Bodrum. Well, if you look at arrivals each month for the last 5 years to the Greek islands from Turkey, what you see is that there were 12, and exactly 12 exceptional months. Before and after, very few people arrived. Look at this. It starts in April 2015, when for the first time more than 10,000 people a month arrive, and it lasts until March 2016, when it drops dramatically. In 12 months, 1 million people arrived in the Greek islands. For them, that was a huge crisis. But before and after, including last year and the year before, the numbers are of a dimension that should be easy to handle if there is some form of management. Now, if we deal with exceptional numbers in exceptional years, we deal with specific reasons. I won't go into them, you know them. Syria, the fact that Turkey was the country with most refugees in the world for many years, and Turkey is literally next to the richest continent, the European Union, has a land and a sea border, and eventually some people started to move. Now, here is the story in a nutshell, the number of Syrians outside of Syria, and by 2014-15, these were millions, and so of course some would come to Europe. And the second reason, now looking at Italy, was the collapse of the Libyan state and the response by the Italian authorities. Now, very interesting, and I'm sure this will lead to an interesting debate. The massive arrival started when the Italian Navy decided to send its ships to the shore of Libya. Look at this. You had 14,000 deaths, which was a drastic failure in 25 years. But in 4 years, you had 17,500 deaths. And where were they? Well, they were not in the Aegean. Despite the dramatic image of Aylan, the little boy, all year 2015, the record year of deaths in the Aegean, there were 800 people who drowned, which was a disaster for the Turks, for the Greeks, for those refugees, bodies washed up all the time, but it never compared to what happened between Libya and Italy. And it stopped when the EU-Turkey agreement entered into force in April 2016. You had 366 deaths in the winter before the EU-Turkey statement, and you had less deaths in the 3 years since then in the whole of the Aegean. So it's not that we can do anything about stopping deaths at sea. While in the central Mediterranean, when the Italian Navy sent out its mission Mare Nostrum, it rescued within 6 months 100,000 people, but 3,000 people drowned. The deadliest period in the Mediterranean was when Italy had sent its ships. Never was a similar number of people drowned. So the problem is not the Geneva Convention, it's something else. Let me, by the way, stress that the core of the convention, the non-refoulement principle, is embodied in so many other conventions by now, from the Convention on Human Rights of Europe to the Anti-Torture Convention, that even if we don't have Geneva, in Germany, the rules for not sending people back would be almost exactly the same. To illustrate what the problem is, one single concrete example, West Africans, which was the largest group coming to Italy. These were not by the large number, recognized refugees. Here, Senegal, and if you look at Senegalese, one of the top 6 nations in those few years, you had 27,000 arrive in Italy in 4 years to apply for asylum. Never more before, never more after. Now, of those, less than 800 received refugee status or subsidiary protection, international protection, which is not surprising since in Senegal there isn't any persecution. But only 335 were returned to Senegal, which meant it didn't matter whether you were a refugee or not. When you arrive in Libya, when you get on a boat, when you arrive in Europe, you can stay. So what Europe had become for these young men, mainly men, from West Africa, is a deadly magnet. You come here, you make it, very few do, 35,000 in 4 years is not a high number for a country of 18 million, very few there, but when you arrive, you can stay. And this attracted some and led to mass deaths at sea. Third error, just one slide on this, to stop migration you need more border guards. Or, as some, again, Collier puts it in his book, less Schengen. Just one simple point, if you talk to border guards, they will immediately dismiss this. When the Finns, and I asked the Finnish border guard service, when I asked them, if you would have been in the Aegean in 2015, would a single less person have arrived from Turkey? They said, of course not, because border guards don't push people back. What border guards do is if somebody comes, is they register them, they rescue them, they bring them on shore, and then if they say we apply for asylum, their job is done. Now, the idea that we get rid of Schengen and would have stopped the movements is just as popular and just as erroneous. On this, simply to point out that between Turkey and Germany, there were at least 5 non-Schengen borders which people had crossed. And as France tried after the terror attack in 2015 to restore controls with Italy, it hasn't stopped the rise in asylum claims in France, which reached record levels last year. The answer why this is so is obvious. There never was a fence between France and Italy or between Austria and Germany. So you get rid of Schengen, but that only means that the few people at the orderly border crossing points, and even then, if they say asylum, you can't send them back, might be discouraged. Everybody else will come anyways. The fourth error, again, popular in Eastern Europe and in some Anglo-Saxon countries, is this whole crisis was caused by misplaced compassion by the Germans and Swedes. Angela Merkel caused it with her selfie. So people came because they thought it would be nice to go to Germany, and they would be welcome. As Collier puts it, Merkel repudiated the Dublin Agreement. If only she would have sent people immediately back to, well, where? Hungary, Austria, Greece? This is complete nonsense. Here is the number of transfers, Dublin transfers to Greece in the last 7 years or 6 years. Well, if you look from 2013 to 2019, although the system in Europe says that the country where people arrive is responsible for asylum claims, it never worked. Italy had less asylum claims in 2014 than Sweden. And if you look at the number of people that actually were returned back to Greece in the last 6 years, you end up with 48. So no, Merkel could not have sent them back because nobody could, nobody ever did. This is a complete red herring. By the way, nobody can now be sent today from Germany to Hungary, even now, because they're being treated so badly in Hungary. And the courts don't allow it. Last error, only drastic measures work. Well, Matteo Salvini rose from a leader of a party with 6% in the last European elections to 35% at the moment in the polls, and he might soon be the Prime Minister of Italy. And he, of course, famously closed the ports. He said, we will boycott rescue ships, we will work with the Libyan militias, we will not let anybody come to Italy. But as the experience of the Aegean shows us, there is another way. In March 2016, the Turkish government offered the Dutch and Germans a proposal. In return for massive humanitarian aid, 6 billion for the refugees in Turkey, Turkey offered from a day X and not before to take back those who, after an assessment of their claims to asylum, the EU decided would be safe in Turkey. Now, the EU decided who to send back. That wasn't up to the Turks. But they said from this day they would be prepared to do so. Look at the impact of this agreement. You had 1 million people arrive in 12 months. The next 12 months, it was 26,000. I mean, you can't think of something more drastic in terms of impact. 1,152 drowned in the Aegean in the 12 months before, 81 drowned in the Aegean in the 12 months since. Now, I'm sure we can discuss this a lot more, but let me conclude then with the 5 errors and what they mean for our thinking about the future. Let's stop using metaphors from meteorology and hydraulics. Refugees are not water. And migration pressure is not something that you can measure. The refugee system is not broken. Yes, there are things that didn't work, and the number of deaths showed us this, but there is a more complicated debate. It has nothing to do with the Refugee Convention. Third, the solution is not more border guards. And, well, this is still something that in these European elections people are promising. This will not make a big difference. Fourth, the crisis was not caused by too much compassion in Northern Europe or by Angela Merkel. And fifth, it is not true that you need to make drastic measures, sign over your rights to Orban, Salvini, and others, or get rid of the Refugee Convention to restore control. Now, once we abolish the false thinking and focus on what we've really learned, we might be heading towards a solution, which I'm sure we'll discuss next. So thank you.
Before that, though, I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. That was a very powerful presentation. Thank you very much indeed for that. In this country, well, only a matter of a few months ago, there was a fairly big sort of news story about, I think about half a dozen migrant boats had come across the channel from France and arrived in Kent. And the Home Secretary was under enormous pressure to demonstrate that he'd be a great leader of the Conservative Party, among other things, and demanded we got another boat in. But there was a counter-argument that we shouldn't actually have more boats because actually this would only encourage the people traffickers, that if you rescued these people from the sea, that more people traffickers would come and they would take people halfway across the channel and someone would rescue them and they'd be taken to the UK and they would get paid. And this is the political argument we hear all the time, is it not? That we need to act in a way that is going to discourage people from making these trips in the first place. Are you saying that that argument is another myth?
No, but it is incomplete. Let's just take the British example concretely. Of course you need to rescue people at sea. I mean, this is a humanitarian obligation. This is what civilization is based on. The question is what happens then. All you need to do to stop people getting into boats from France to go to Britain on the sea is you rescue them and return them to France. Which, since France is an EU country with a right to asylum, should be no problem at all. In fact, the whole Calais jungle story, I've been there a few times, I never understood. All you need to do is have an agreement. I mean, people are registered, you register people, and if people arrive in Britain, France agrees to take them back. Then people would not try at danger to their life to get onto the ferries or onto the tracks or onto the cars. I mean, this is an issue of management. And since France is already a European country where you can apply for asylum, and in fact more people did than in Britain, this would solve the problem. Now, in the central Mediterranean, what is clear is that we can't return people to Libya. I mean, in Libya, people are being tortured and abused, and there is a business model. But look at the numbers. In the first 3 months of this year, the Libyan Coast Guards brought back 900 people in 3 months. Now, we give the Libyans a lot of money, and I don't understand why the European Union is not using that leverage to say everybody that they are bringing back within their territorial waters, the moment they arrive at the coast in Libya, and there is somebody from UNHCR IOM to register them, they can be flown out to Niger. And then in Niger, we do an assessment of their refugee status, or if they are not refugees, we offer them to return to their country of origin. Now, with those numbers we have at the moment, the political problem of this is solvable if we want to. Now, in Turkey it's different. I mean, Turkey has 3 million Syrians. The EU is spending a lot of money on those Syrians. The idea that no Syrian is safe in Turkey makes no sense. So when the Turks said, we are going to take Syrians back from Greece, the only problem is we need to then be able to determine in each individual case still if that individual has a reason to be afraid to be returned to Turkey, which most Syrians don't, but a few might. And here's the problem. We are unable to make this decision quickly. The single biggest structural problem in our refugee system is that in Italy it took you 4 years until a final rejection of refugee status, if you go through all the claims. So this is what we ought to be talking about. How can we, with numbers that make it plausible, determine within a few weeks, with legal support, with credible asylum services, and with the right to appeal, who needs protection in Europe and who doesn't? And how can we reach agreements with countries of origin to take back their citizens from a date and offer them legal migration in return?
And we've seen some of that. You've kind of sort of crossed my artificial border between looking back and looking forward. And you've moved into the new world of answers and solutions, which is where we want to sort of discuss for the next 10 minutes or so before we offer a chance for you to ask some questions. And Gerald, I know that the ESI, your think tank, has published a number of policy papers recently on exactly this, on the kind of things that we ought to be doing, and you've just reflected on one, which is looking at the kind of arrangements you might have between countries and so on. Let's move a little bit more rapidly this time, so we've got time for questions. But just if there were kind of 2 or 3 things that you think we should do right now so that we cannot have the kind of horror of thousands of people drowning on the coasts of Europe, what would those be? I'm going to writing down things very quickly, but I've thrown it at you. But what would you do?
Well, we need to be moral realists. So we need to have solutions that can actually work, but that don't betray our moral values. By which I mean the European Convention on Human Rights, the non-refoulement principle, and the fact that we don't let people drown. Now, the question then is, who is the we? The we is not going to include all Europeans. This is clear. Salvini, Orban, other European leaders have built their career on rejecting those values. They are succeeding. Salvini is the most popular government minister in Italy at the moment. So they will not take part. So the first very concrete recommendation, we stop looking to the European Union, and a group of countries where the public still believes that they have an interest in controlling borders in a humane way moves forward. So France, Germany, the Benelux, Spain.
A new body?
A core, like Schengen, outside of the European Union initially, with the goal to show how you can manage migration in an orderly way and control borders, reduce irregular arrivals without violating the right to
Quite scary, that. I mean, for the politicians, even those sort of, as you described, the more liberal, more enlightened countries perhaps, quite scary because you might well inspire a greater populist reaction to that.
Except, and here is the second interesting point, we should stop being afraid to death. The country that took in most refugees in the last few years, which was Germany, is the country where the far right is among the weakest. Look around Germany's neighbors. You have the AfD is currently back at 10% in the polls. Okay. There is a consensus of all the core parties. Angela Merkel has approval ratings again of 2/3 of the German public who say she should serve out her full term. Now the prime minister, the chancellor of the country, that took in more refugees than all of the rest of the EU, plus America, Canada, and Australia together, is still there and is popular. Now this is an important message to politicians. You know who lost power? The politicians who first said we rescue everyone and bring them, and then changed track in the middle, like in Italy, Mr. Renzi and his government, who first said we bring in everybody, and then made his interior minister, Minniti, make deals with Libyan militias and start attacking the rescue boats. Now then people say, well, if that's what we're going to do, we might as well vote for Salvini. And so I think that the message is, if you can offer control and empathy, if you can say Germany continues to receive the largest number of asylum seekers in Europe at the moment, I don't see a rebellion. The Green Party, which is pro-refugee, is doing better than ever. Angela Merkel is popular. The consensus around, there was no big debate. I was at the Bavarian Party conference a few weeks ago, the CSU. There was more discussion about how to rescue bees than how to stop refugees at the border.
Really? Bees?
Yes,
no,
there was a referendum in Bavaria on rescuing bees, and it was very popular, and so the leader of the party, lots of people signed it. So more talk about ecology, global climate, etc., than about refugees. Because I think this is the key lesson, and here is looking forward. We need to make clear, our politicians, that we can control things. So what we should do with those Senegalese is we offer Senegal a regular quota of migrants. A few thousand a year for the next 5 years to a few European countries. In return for Senegal agreeing to take back every one of its citizens who arrives after a date X. So those who are now here, Senegal will not take back, with a few exceptions. Fine. Let's offer them a chance to integrate. Let's not keep them at the margin of society. But those who arrive from now on, we want to give a signal. Don't go to Libya. Don't get on the boats. Because if you are not a refugee, if you don't get protection, you'll be returned within a few weeks. In return,
we offer legal migration. Now, this sort of thing should be negotiated today. And
Who
this
does
group,
it, though? I mean, you talk about the core group. Well, perhaps Rossella, maybe this is where we bring you in, actually, because you mentioned the global contract in 2018. You meant compact, sorry, yes. You also mentioned, well, your own organization published Better Protecting Refugees in the EU and globally in 2016. And I was glancing at it earlier today. I mean, where does the UN, where does the UNHCR sit in terms of the kind of ideas that Gerald has been talking about, the kind of way in which countries might have a humane and rapid and well understood system that actually brings some order to this chaos?
Well, we certainly support the idea that there should be, the procedure should be fast, efficient, and fair. But we also feel that the fact that there are sometimes processes that go on forever are indeed one of the problems to a proper management of asylum. We do not agree with the idea of externalizing and sort of essentially farming out the control of the European border to other countries outside. We think that there has to be robust sharing of responsibility with other countries, also because I think it's both unfair and unrealistic to expect.
What does that look like? Just explain to me when you say sharing of responsibilities.
Well, it means that you cannot really have a system that is only based on the fact that somebody else will take them all and so that nobody will come to your country. Right. I think that really, I think it's unfair, but it's also, frankly, impractical. So there has to be a system that allows people to come into the European Union. We can discuss and decide what is the best way of doing that. And then at the same time, support for those who remain in other countries along the way.
And I just want at this point to go back to the conversation I had with Christian after his presentation about the difference between an economic migrant and a refugee. Indeed, refugee seems to be a very tightly defined person. And there are obviously a large number of people who wouldn't fall under that category. How do we deal with that? Because politically, as I said, I think most countries as signatories would say, yes, we have a responsibility, we'll do what we're required to do. But they do feel that they want to have, I mean, in the British sense, control of our borders, that we decide who comes. And that's problematic. So how do we deal with this? Because, someone just, arrives, they say, just processing them is quite problematic, certainly before you define them.
Well, I think it's kind of, first of all, in some ways, the refugee framework is a regime of exception. In other words, countries or blocks or wherever they fix they put their borders have a right to control their borders and decide who gets in. However, countries have committed themselves to allowing in all those who fear for their lives and who are in need of international protection. So that is an exception that that countries have voluntarily agreed to. And as you were saying, these are not like, God knows what immense numbers. So the question, of course, is that there are others who may not be entitled to that kind of protection. Now, we believe that it's practical for states to have proper migration policies. One of the reasons why you're having so many people applying for refugee status when they're not actually asylum seekers, or there are some people who do so, it's because there is no other channel. So they feel that they have no choice but applying for refugee status. That's not a failure of the refugee system, and it's not a failure of the convention. That's a failure of the immigration.
It's a reality at the border,
surely, but
and for the politicians who are there to
What I'm saying is that if you want to have a proper management of the borders, you have to have also a system that allows people to come into the countries as migrants. And many of our countries have aging populations, and they do actually need migrants to maintain their economy. Now, that being said, and that comes also to the question about the BBC and calling everybody a migrant, which of course we also have a problem with. The question now is that migrants do not have an established right to establish themselves somewhere else. So when somebody is found not to be in need of international protection, then either he or she can be admitted under a different set of rules and policies, etc., or it should be sent back. There should be the return has to be ideally voluntary, with the necessary, in respect of human rights, etc., maybe with some additional inducement and with some. But that you cannot have a system in which there is only a way in and no way out, because that then turns out to be really destructive, both in terms of the use that can be made of it, but also we end up with people who are allowed in the country, as the case that he was making, in which people who actually end up in the margin of society. They have no documents, they have theoretically no right to services or to work, etc. And what are they expected to do? So I think it's really a question, you have to have a management system that ensures that rights are respected, but also that people who are not entitled to stay, then go home.
Exactly. And Christian, I'm going to bring you in here because you mentioned this point about the aging population of Europe, and actually, we need to have more people of working age and so on. And that sort of came up in your argument as well in terms of the economic migrant side of this. But here's the dilemma. This control of borders issue, some of the arguments that Gerald mentioned of the far right. People just aren't convinced. People do not think that they are going to benefit. They do not see immigration in the broader sense as good news. They see it as a threat.
Well, I didn't make that point. And I don't think that the demographic change we see in Europe and in some other countries is in any way addressable by migration. Migration will play a very, very small role in addressing that. Again, of course, we have to distinguish between refugees and other migrants. Gerald made a very powerful presentation, and I think, however, that the conclusions he draws from that are at the same time very dangerous. So I understand that what Gerald suggests is that we have a core of European countries that moves forward. I think that kind of misses out that, well, much of what we have seen happening in Europe is actually really very much in accordance with the points you refuted. So the Dublin Agreement is simply something which did not work. And it's not that it didn't work because we didn't manage it well. It didn't work because the political realities in various countries dictated those governments to actually not obey the obligations they have under the Dublin Agreement. Because it's just simply very dangerous for a centrist government in times of populist pressure to be seen to be weak on migration. So that's why they simply close up. I think...
But what is the... I mean, so if Gerald's argument is, well, look, you're never going to get the Hungarians on board, but we have to move forward, so those people who are movable, let's work with them. What would you do? How are you going to get the Hungarians on board?
So I mean, well, so that's again, of course, a number thing. So to say, well, of course, the pressure on Europe has eased, but it has not eased because refugee movements have gone down. The figures I showed you, from 2012 to 2019, the number of refugees across the world has actually doubled and is increasing still. So what has happened is that we successfully re-established, to close the borders towards the southern Mediterranean and the eastern part, as Gerald has pointed out, partly with contracts with Libya and partly with contracts with Turkey. That doesn't mean the refugee problem has gone away, and it doesn't mean it will go away in the future. So the question is, how do we respond to that in the future? And well, I don't see that we create a core of countries who will continue to kind of adjust to large numbers of.
Does it have to be at EU level?
Refugees.
Will you do it at EU level?
Unfortunately, the only solution. I think the real danger here is that any policy on refugees, which by the majority population is seen to be detrimental. And when we go back in Europe, look at different migration policies we have seen in different countries, whenever we had something which was considered to be weak, whether it's the Netherlands, whether it's Denmark 20 years ago, etc., it always was followed by a political backslash of radical white parties getting into government control or influencing government parties, and then the country closed completely down. And I'm pretty sure we will see that in Sweden, and I'm I'm not in agreement with Gerald that we haven't seen that in Germany. So the policy of Germany for more than 1 year was basically stagnant because of the fallout, political fallout.
All right, there's the problem, but what's the solution? How do we corral the politicians?
To get control of our borders, I think that is very important. To find methods to deal with genuine refugee applications, humanitarian applications, and of course I'm in agreement with both Rossella and Gerald, who in a very efficient and quick way sort out those who, under the Geneva Convention and auxiliary agreement, don't have a right to come to us from those who actually do have a right. And then we talk about completely different numbers. And I think that's very important that we do that. And then, of course, the third solution is we have to do something about the situation in those countries where refugees are coming.
Let's not have wars.
And so that means we need to create economic and political stability much more intensive than we have done that over the last 20 years, and not create wars.
Yeah, Rossella, very quickly.
If I may just very quickly, the kind of the recognition rates are sometimes a bit sort of deceptive. That is, when you see a population that gets 60% recognition rate, meaning, okay, so 40% are illegal migrants and all the rest, it's a bit deceptive because different standards have been applied, and at least some of the people who are being rejected sometimes might actually be persons who are in need of protection nonetheless.
And would count under the convention?
And could be under the convention, yes.
But you
Sometimes
see, there's the issue. I mean, you're disputing the numbers, and you know, that there is the problem. We want to have this fast, quick system at the border, but almost immediately we're saying, well, actually, this person failed under the test, but actually they're probably okay.
No, this really says that we have to make sure that we apply the convention in a manner that is consistent across the board. So I'm not saying that this is we're having a second thought.
All right, I want to bring Gerald in very briefly, then I want to come to the audience, if I may. Just finishing up on that point, just to respond, and if you want to Christian's point.
Well, so if we are looking for a concrete issue, we have today a few boats or German NGOs in the Mediterranean. They are rescuing a few hundred people a month. And as they rescue these people from drowning, Italy has closed its ports. It doesn't take a single boat, a single person to disembark in Italy. Now, Italy will not change. Salvini is successful with this policy. He's winning votes. So what do? If we don't want to have Salvini set our policy for Europe, then the 4 countries which last time, a few days ago, decided, well, we just voluntarily take those 64 people on that boat of the CI NGO, those 4 countries need a system, right? I mean, how long should they wait? Should they wait for Orban? Should they wait for Salvini? Should they wait for Kaczynski? Should they wait for the Austrian Minister of Interior who says that he wants to get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights? No. So what should they do? They should say, we are going to set up a reception center in the EU where we bring those people, but what we will do differently from the past 4 years is we will then have an assessment of whether they are economic migrants or refugees with enough resources, asylum case workers, lawyers, to be able to know within a few weeks. And we will make agreements with the major countries of origin.
Will this be expensive?
No, I mean, it's nothing compared to the costs of this huge Operation Sophia, which in the end, I mean, a big EU naval operation, which in the end wasn't even allowed to go to the regions where there were refugee boats. You know, this is the things we need to do. We need to be realistic, and they're doable. And that's why it's important to not fall for the apocalyptic numbers, for the sense that there are these huge movements, because then, of course, you say, but you can never manage this. This is not the case. All the Greek islands at the moment, there are 14,000 people. This can be managed.
All right. We've got probably 10 minutes or so to take some questions. We've got 2 roving microphones. They rove very fast. So put your hand up if you've got a question. Yeah, I can see two questions up there. We'll do one and then the other.
Yeah, thanks so much. My question is about research. So if you
Can you sorry, I should have said, could you just give it roughly where you're from so we get an idea?
Okay, my name is Lutz Hager from the London School of Economics. My question is about research. If you had the attention of a room full of academics and economists, do you have a specific question and topic where you think it's most important that we see research done, and a question that you'd like to have answered?
Right, good question for this audience. Christian, I mean, you're a professor at UCL. I mean, where would you like to see a bit more cash splashed?
Well, I think one of the major challenges we face at the moment is to integrate those refugee populations into our economies and societies. Well, for that, we need to understand much better the particularities of these populations. We need to understand much better what actually happens in the first month after they arrive, when they are in asylum camps and may get exposure to all types of ideas, etc. We need to have much better data. So I think that is one of the major challenges. As I pointed out, refugees who come to us for refugee reasons, many of those who came to us from Syria 1 year earlier would never have dreamt that they end up in Germany or Austria or any other country. So they are completely unprepared and in that sense very different from economic migrants. So I think one of the key areas of research should be to understand better how we can help them to become important and contributing members of our economies and of our society.
Gerald, where would you spend the money?
Well, I spend most of my time now talking to practitioners, people in ministries of interior, people in parliament, and I tell you that the discrepancy between the amount of talk about refugee issues and the actual concrete answers that you can give to a civil servant in Germany, Switzerland, Italy, if they ask, how do we do that, is huge. So if you are, as a researcher, prepared to actually do empirical work, to actually study how administrations work, to study real experiences, to get into the nuts and bolts, the field is wide open. I mean, I tell you, I recently met the head of one of the biggest asylum services in Europe, and he asked me and our think tank to provide information on how the Spanish system actually works. You know? Now, this is not surprising to me, and I've seen this in the European Parliament, I've seen this in many institutions. 3 issues to study. How is it possible that we can do resettlement faster? You know, how do we do all the security checks which any country will insist on, and it shouldn't last like in the US for like a year or 2? How can we do asylum determination faster? What resources do we realistically need to know if somebody's an economic migrant or gets protection? With all the quality controls that we need. And thirdly, what kind of offers work with countries of origin to take back a number of people that actually makes a difference to future flows? I mean, let's be realistic. And let's study that.
You'd need a model. You'd need a real situation.
Yes, and I mean, anybody who's interested, contact me. I mean, I'm constantly meeting desperate politicians.
You're easy to find, Gerald.
Easy to find. Desperate politicians who are looking for advice. I mean, this is not an exaggeration.
All right, Rossella.
No, I would add, since something has already been said, I would add studying more about places from which migrants are actually coming. Because I think finding ways... Economic migrants. Yeah. So finding ways to have truly targeted development activities that decrease the need or to migrate and to join these flows, I would say. Okay,
good. And there was a question just behind, wasn't there? And is there one over this side of the room, which I can come to in a moment? Yes, gentleman up there. So this one first, and then we'll come to that gentleman there. Yeah. No, you, yes.
There has already been a lot of research done in terms of migrants and refugees on the economies. Professor Knaus has done quite a lot of this, for example. Do not have great economic wages, and research in the US shows, for example, that illegal immigrants and non-occupied immigrants have much less chance of crime than others. Yet the wide and well-researched areas which many economists have done has not changed the debate at all. Is there any reason why that might be the case?
Okay, let's keep this brief, because do you want to come in on that? I mean, no, well, maybe Christian. I mean, perhaps the question was addressed to you, actually. Why are scientists not making more, ground in this stuff?
Well, we know that we don't need experts.
That was, I feared was probably going to be the answer. It is a difficult political issue. There's the gentleman up here.
I'm Alan Winters from the University of Sussex. I want to clarify something that Gerald said, so Gerald can answer, but I would be interested in the rest of the panel's views. You implied, Gerald, that we say to the Senegalese, we will give you a quota of legal migrants, and in return you will take anybody back. Is your proposition that creating a quota of legal migrants will reduce the pressure of refugee flows or undocumented migrants, or is it essentially just conscience money that we think we can then strike a deal with the Senegalese that they will take people back? This trade-off between sort of legal and then undocumented migrants is a very difficult area. Think about Britain. All the European migrants into Britain are here perfectly legally. Didn't help very greatly in the debates we've had in the last few years.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
Well, the idea that, well, first of all, I think we always should look at the dimensions, the numbers, the size, the quantities. You know, 36,000 people who leave a country of 18 million in 4 years, it's negligible. So we can never identify even the part of Dakar where we should give our development money to stop a few thousand people from trying. And it's only a few thousand people a year, right? So I think the link between development aid and this kind of migration is very indirect. In fact, I think development aid will be distorted. Now, what is important about the quotas of legal access is an incentive to governments for their political message to their people that they are not going to cooperate with former colonial powers to stop people leaving. This would not work. If you talk to politicians in African countries, they will not say, we are going to take back everybody who's arrived in Europe, although the numbers for us really don't matter much, but which is hugely unpopular. But if you would be realistic and say to the Senegalese, listen, we offer you 3 things. Those who are now in Germany or France, where most of them are, as long as they're not criminals, we open a path to legalization. I mean, there are 8,000 people from Gambia just in Baden-Württemberg, one of the states of Germany. They will not be returned. Secondly, in return for this, and in addition, we offer you an agreement where you get a few thousand legal scholarships and migration a year from Gambia, a nation of 2 million people, to a few European countries. But our requirement, thirdly, is that from this date, from the 1st of May 2019, you agree to help us identify and take back Gambians who arrive across the sea so that they don't come. The goal should be that they take back as few people as possible. All this talk about mass deportations, no Minister of Interior knows how to do them because countries of origin will never cooperate. I mean, this is another red herring in politics. What we need to do to preserve popular support for the Refugee Convention and be realistic is have very few returns of those who don't need protection only, but have them strategic. So from the state, people might be returned. They don't make the trip anymore, but there is a legal chance to come. Okay. That's the scheme.
All right. I want to take one more question. Unfortunately, that's probably going to be the last one. Yes, lady down there.
Thank you. I'm Stefania Paredes from the University of Warwick. I think something that has not been said is that the rise of populist parties and far-right parties have been linked to the worsening of economic conditions of the bottom of the income distributions in a lot of European countries. Think about Brexit, think about Italy, the number of unemployed. So, in a way, trying to solve internal problems or the domestic economic policy and linked to austerity measures in all these countries might actually help to solve the refugee crisis. As Gerald said, the numbers are actually quite small, so it's not a crisis per se, but it's the perception that these parties have used these migrants as these are the people who are stealing your jobs. These are the people you should blame for the economic conditions you are in, when actually we know that it's the outcome of poor economic policy. So we might need to be looking at more domestic policies rather than looking just international.
Good question. Thank you very much indeed, Rossella. This is the real. We've talked about it a few times, but the political realities of immigration in a wider sense. You're right. Brexit. The vote for Brexit in this country happened with the news broadcasting pictures of migrants crossing over the Mediterranean into Italy and elsewhere. This stuff really resonates with people, and it appears to be having an impact. I mean, I take Gerald's point, but the far right has got to be a concern for many.
Well, that's a very good point, but I think it's also a point that shows how the issue has been, if you wish, misused. And if you are mentioning the fact, for example, the picture that was shown about the arrivals of Syrians or others to Europe being used to justify Brexit, whatever one may think about, whether or not the UK should or shouldn't be in the European Union, that was clearly a red herring because being in the European Union in no way obliged the UK to take people who were coming. The only people that were obliged, that the UK is obliged to take within the European Union
the issue
are
of
Europeans,
immigration
are other EU
shot up
citizens.
the sort of political scene in this country.
No,
it was number one issue.
It did, but interestingly, it no longer is. So I think it's kind of, these issues show up, but of course it depends also on how they're fed. And this is
how do you deal with that?
Well, I think it's, at the end of the day, particularly in this environment where I think the news and communication have taken a very different role from what they had before. They really create public opinion instead of only reporting public opinion. I think we have to be, we have to also sort of communicate. We have found it useful to communicate, to try and sort of show that indeed both refugees are not a threat generally, that refugees are people like everybody else. They share the same kind of necessities and the same kind of needs that everybody else does. And we try to show whenever possible data, and that comes maybe to the question of research. If I read somewhere, for example, that in fact, and here I'm not talking about refugees, but I read somewhere that, for example, European Union nationals in the UK pay more taxes than they consume in services. If this is correct, obviously this was a fact that somehow was not sufficiently maybe brought to the attention. I don't want to get into internal politics,
papers
but
on the BBC,
I think we see that happening in many different settings. So coming back, providing a more sober view, providing facts and presenting stories, because at the end of the day, I think now more than before, people tend to react perhaps to emotional stories than they do to pure rational.
So the response needs to be emotional.
So I think you need both. You need to sort of show the data, but also show that at the end of the day, we're talking about people that we can really relate to when we get to know them.
Okay. All right. Sadly, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much to Gerald, to Rossella, and to Christian. Thank you to you for all of your points and questions. And I just thought I'd finish by actually just some figures which I found on the UNHCR website, which are pretty up to date if you want to get a picture of what's happening right now. Just this year, and we're not, your numbers suggested that the problem is not what it was, but that may be right, but more than 400 people have died or are missing, having attempted to cross the Mediterranean this year already. That's 400 too many. These are desperate people. How we respond to that remains vital, I think, in terms of our political and our social stability, as we've discussed, but also, and just as importantly, for the values that we all claim to hold. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks very much.